Great. Thank you. And so sorry, we have little audio video issues here, but we'll try to power through. As I was saying, I'm excited to introduce this presentation. We've got a lot of great content talking about the 4 phases framework and modeling. I'll just do one slide on the overall project. So we're working across last year and this year with products coming out into next year, analyzing the rapidly increasing role of energy storage in the electric grid through 2050. We have a number of products. I think it's important to say that we're looking at this at the grid level as well as the distributed generation level PV plus battery adoption, for example. And we'll have a future webinar on that report, which should come out shortly. I think our one key conclusion, which you'll hear a lot about today, is under all scenarios, the dramatic growth in grid energy storage is the least cost option. And lastly, on the bottom there, all of our reports across the entire study are available at the Storage Features website. Next slide. And today you're really going to hear about our very first report led by Paul Denholm and our third document led by Will Fraser on the 4 phases of storage deployment. In between, we've released a model input data report led by Chad Augustine. And as I said, we're about to release the distributed storage adoption scenarios. And later in the year, we'll release grid operational impacts of storage, looking at operational modeling, and then finally a key learning summary report. So look forward to those. And with that, I will let Paul take it away. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nate. So my name is Paul Denholm. I work on the storage feature study with Nate and Will, and what we're going to talk about today is this framing document. And the reason why we wanted to create this framing document is to really understand the potential opportunities for storage and the evolution of storage deployment. So we came up with this, what we're calling visionary framework. Now this is a narrative framework that kind of helps set the stage, and then I think that Will's work will kind of really put some numbers, hard numbers on this, to give you a better feeling for what the real opportunities are, which, as Nate said, and we will repeat a number of times, the significant large opportunities. So what we did was create this 4 phases concept describing how the storage markets may evolve, generally from kind of short duration storage to longer duration storage. So we'll go through this in detail. I'll talk a little bit more about the implications of this chart, but this is just kind of to set the stage. And there's a lot of caveats here, mainly including the fact that there's a lot of overlap and uncertainty. Keep that in mind. This isn't intended to be kind of very detailed and precise. This is a narrative framework, again, to help set the stage and give you an understanding. So it's important to note the significant deployments of pump storage. Pump storage is still by far the largest, and will continue to be for some time, the largest contributor of energy storage in the US and indeed around the world, with something on the order of 23 gigawatts of total deployments. You can see that the energy storage overall industry stagnated pretty much starting around 1990. You've got some residual deployments from plants that were started in the 80s and early 90s, but really we've had kind of a 2+ decade lull in deployment that's only recently reemerged. So this is where we're starting, and again, it is important to recognize the continued role of pump storage and potential opportunities for new pump storage. But there's a lot of changes going on, so that's what we really want to talk about, is these new developments that have happened. So one of the things that's really important to talk about when we consider energy storage is this power versus energy component. And these cartoons are partially here to illustrate this. And you can take a look at the report to get a better idea of what we're talking about here. But the idea, again, is there's the power component, which is the size of a pump storage turbine or the size of the power conversion equipment in a battery. That's the megawatts. And then, of course, there's the stored energy, or the megawatt hours. And the reason why this is so important is because the costs scale as the number of megawatt hours per megawatt, or hours. So the interesting thing is some technologies have a very strong energy cost related component. So you can see with batteries, the initial power related cost, which is you can think of in terms of a storage device that actually can't store any energy. So it's like a 0 hour storage device. And then that cost rises dramatically. Whereas other technologies, something like say hydrogen, if you're storing that hydrogen underground, the energy costs may be very low, but the power related costs. And so this scale, the way that these costs scale is going to be a big driver behind this four phases concept and the transition from shorter to longer duration storage. Another way to think about it is kind of what's the marginal cost of the next hour of capacity? And this is the concept here where the first hour may be expensive because you've got not only the energy but the power related components. But then when you get into that second, third, fourth hour, the incremental costs could be quite low. And again, this is for something like hydrogen, the incremental cost of an extra hour may be close to zero, whereas for a battery, you still have the cost of those battery modules themselves. So these concepts really apply when you start thinking about, okay, well, what kinds of services might we provide with these? And there's a lot of papers out there and discussion of all the hundreds of different services that energy storage can provide. But one way to think about it is to really boil it down into larger categories: capacity, energy, transmission, and ancillary services. And these are kind of the main services, these categories of the main services provided in the electric power sector. And when you look at the value proposition for each of these and the amount provided, you can kind of start to get an idea of where energy storage might be going. So where we start is operating reserves. So these are these fast response services that instantaneously balance supply and demand. And there's a bunch of different aspects of operating reserves. Primarily, well, how much do you need? How fast do you need to respond? And how long do you need to respond for? And all of these factors add up into the different types of operating reserves needed. So this is kind of a messy um, chart, but this really gives you an idea of all the different services that are required in the grid, ranging from really fast frequency response to regulating reserves, also sometimes called frequency regulation, and the various spinning reserve products. And so this is where energy storage started in the early 2000s, going after these markets, because again, you don't need a whole lot of energy. You need power, but you don't need a whole lot of energy. So things like flywheels and certain battery types are really well suited for this because, again, you don't need a whole lot of energy. This provides an idea of what we talk about the marginal value of these services and how this relates to the duration. So you can see that the value of a storage device providing spinning reserves increases as a function of duration for that device. So if I've got a 1 megawatt storage device, if I've got 10 minutes of energy storage capacity, I can get some certain amount of value. And you can see that that goes up to 30 minutes. The reason why it goes up to stops increasing at 30 minutes is because that's all you're required to provide. Once you can discharge for 30 minutes, you don't get any more value for this service if you can go to 40 or 50 or 60 minutes. That's the technical and market requirement for this service. And again, this is going to be a key theme because once you saturate the duration requirement, there really isn't any point in providing more energy, more duration. So in this particular case, it doesn't make any sense to go more than 30 minutes. And when you do kind of the benefit cost ratio in this particular example, you see that for something like a lithium ion battery, you're already in the money. So the benefit cost ratio of a lithium ion battery providing something like a spinning reserve product with a 30-minute duration, that's already a cost-effective source of this particular service. And these kinds of calculations, these kinds of value propositions for something like a 30-minute battery was a big reason why we've seen such significant deployment over the past decade of shorter duration, basically 1 hour or less, flywheels and batteries deployed around the country. So we're approaching a gigawatt of new battery and other short duration um, storage to provide these services. So this is why we call this phase one, because the vast majority of the storage deployed over the past decade is being deployed for these shorter duration services. Now, there is a limit to that, and that limit is the simple amount of what we need for all of these services. So when you look at something like frequency regulation, which is kind of the really hot, uh, early deployment of energy storage, well, you only need 5 gigawatts or so, or of total frequency regulation for the entire U.S. So we've already got a gigawatt. You've got other resources that are competing in that market. So this is kind of where the limits to phase one are, and why, while an early entrant, an important entrant, if you think about where storage is going next, it's beyond these operating reserve markets. It's something else. And that's when we move into phase two, which is really around batteries providing peaking services. Over the next 20 years, we expect something on the order of 150 gigawatts of peaking plants to retire. So these are gas-fired turbines, old oil and gas steam plants, and you can see that big cluster of plants installed in the 70s. Well, those are aging out. This doesn't really have anything to do with um, carbon policy or anything like that. This is just the power plants are getting old and need to be replaced. So the question is, can batteries provide an alternative? And this really comes down to provision of peak capacity, or can I provide energy during the period where demand is highest, and what is the requirement there? And you can kind of look at the length of that peak. So these are load curves on a peak day in New York and Florida. And so you can see kind of the peak length of that peak period and say, okay, if that's say 4 hours or 2 hours, that's the duration required to meet the peak demand period, or basically have a battery that can provide peaking capacity. So in response to FERC Order 841 and other requirements, ISO RTO market regions have come up with a minimum duration requirement, or how long of a battery, how much duration do you need to provide peaking capacity? And in most regions, it was 4 hours. Now, PJM is in the process of changing the rules. They originally proposed 10. That was fairly controversial, so that's being revised. But you can see a lot of folks are saying, okay, as long as you can provide 4 hours, that will provide sufficient capacity for meeting the peak. Now, it may seem short, right? You say, oh gosh, well, you need demand 24/7. But the point again is, it's that peak demand. If you can clip off that peak, the other generators in your system can provide the other base and intermediate load requirements. We're really just focusing on those short peak demand periods for energy storage right now. So going back, I talked about the how once you get to 30 minutes for spinning reserves, you saturate that value. The same thing applies for something like a peaking capacity. Once you've provided 4 hours of storage, the fifth hour of storage, it's worthless. It has no incremental value other than something like energy time shifting. But once you get to 5 or 6 hours, that arbitrage value, that energy shifting value starts to decline rapidly. So the first couple of hours, first 2, 3, 4 hours, you're arbitraging the highest differential between off-peak and on-peak periods. So you get a lot of value. That value starts to decline as you add more hours of duration. So again, this is why we see something like the total value proposition increases rapidly once you get to 4 hours, and then you don't have much incremental value beyond 4 hours under these market conditions. So this is why when we talk about peaking capacity, a big driver behind something like a 4 hour battery is that's the kind of the sweet spot to maximize value. And depending on the cost of energy storage, we see the maximum benefit cost ratio peaking at about at 4 hours, beyond which the incremental value starts to decline. And so we're right at the point where we've got this in much of the country, the point where we're at the point where energy storage of 4 hours has a positive benefit cost ratio, or benefit cost ratio greater than one, which is why we're seeing increased interest and deployment of 4 hour batteries being deployed for these peaking applications, either standalone or deployed also with PV to take advantage of things like the investment tax credit. So phase two, this deployment of 4 hour, maybe 6 hour batteries for peak, it also has a limit. The limit occurs when the saturation, the length of the peaks exceed 4 hours. And that's possible with fairly limited deployments of 4 hour batteries. You get to the point where your peaks are now longer than 4 hours, and that value of a 4 hour battery starts to decrease. But the really fun thing is how there's this strong synergy between storage and PV. Effectively, solar photovoltaics not only clips the top of the peak, but it clips the left side of the peak. So when you look at these curves, you can kind of visually see the length of the peak at zero. That's 4 or 6 hours. But look at the peak length of that peak in that gray curve. You can see how that's significantly narrowed. And there's this strong synergy between PV kind of clipping the early part of the day. So that's providing your peaking demand from say noon to 4 p.m. And then batteries can hit your peaks from say 4 to 8 p.m. So in combination, those resources can continue to provide peaking capacity well beyond what they would be able to do as as individual resources. So looking at the opportunity for something like 4 to 6 hour batteries, it's fairly modest in today's grid with limited PV deployments. But as you see the amount of PV increase in the coming years and decades, the opportunities for 4 or 6 hour batteries increases dramatically, really extending the overall market opportunities for these relatively short duration storage and reducing the need for something like an 8 or 10 hour resource well out into the future. So this is a great opportunity for some resources. It may be disappointing for other folks that are betting more on the longer duration resources, but this is just kind of the way the math works out in terms of the synergy providing these benefits in the coming years and decades. And Will is going to kind of demonstrate this quantitatively in his analysis. So that we do eventually, however, saturate the ability of 4 or 6 hour batteries. So this slide is a little bit messy, but essentially what you're seeing here is the change in the net load or the need for peaking capacity as we introduce both PV, wind, and storage. And I'd basically point out the green line, which is essentially what's happening after we've deployed a significant amount of solar and 4 to 6 hour batteries in phase two. You get to load peaks that are now something like 7 hours wide in this particular example. So we really have saturated the ability of a 4 hour battery to provide peak, and now we do need to go with something longer. And so we call it the age of ubiquitous storage, in part because we see the costs, the energy related costs of batteries declining, or energy storage in general. So this isn't just lithium ion, these are potentially other battery resources. And again, things like the next generation pump storage providing opportunities. I talked about 7 hour batteries or 7 hour storage. Again, if we're talking now about 8, 10 hour storage technologies, this is where this the late 2020s 2030 type time frame where we begin to saturate the shorter duration 4 to 6 hour battery market and have these opportunities for longer duration storage. So this is kind of that transition into phase three. Now, one of the things, and I'm not going to talk about this in a lot of detail because Will's paper really goes into this in a lot of detail and is really fun. There may be continued opportunities for less than 8 hour storage based on the ability of high power curtailment events or those high power spikes of PV related energy in the middle of the day. So you might have something like a 4 hour battery that absorbs that short spike of PV energy in the middle of the day, and then you're derated later in the day. So you use the full power capacity of a 4 hour device earlier in the day, and then discharge that later in the day over a longer time period. So that's an interesting opportunity that may extend the opportunities for something like a 4 hour battery. But there are ultimately limits to what you can do with what we call diurnal storage. Essentially, you can get to the point where you completely flatten the load and you have kind of a flat net load for 24, 48 hour periods. And of course, this problem of where in the spring you completely saturate the demand for electricity with wind and solar and diurnal storage. So if we look at the seasonal, the seasonal mismatch, that's where things get interesting and the potential transition into phase four or seasonal storage, where you're storing energy in the spring using curtailed wind and solar, and then discharging that in the summer using hydrogen or some other type of resource. So this is kind of the transition to that seasonal storage or phase four. But again, this is at very large deployments of renewable energy. This is really that 90% plus of renewable energy where we start to see the opportunities for this phase 4 transition. And I think we're only kind of getting a handle on the opportunities in these areas. So I know that was a quick overview, but again, the idea behind this is to present this kind of semi-quantitative overview of the opportunities and what some of the characteristics are of each of these phases. Again, just as a reminder, starting with 1 hour shorter duration storage for operating reserves, moving into the peaking capacity where we're making that transition right now, but ultimately transitioning to longer, but still diurnal storage in phase 3. And then finally, when we saturate the ability of diurnal storage and we transition to that seasonal problem, that's when we see the potential transition to phase 4. Again, considerable overlap, particularly you're going to see some transitions happening earlier. Certainly places like California are likely to saturate the diurnal storage before other places. So these aren't necessarily hard and fast rules, but I think still a reasonable framework to think about what the opportunities might be. But I really wanted to transition now and let's start putting some numbers on what the opportunities are for these different durations. And with that, I want to transition to Will, whose recent analysis does exactly that and gives you an idea of what the really exciting opportunities are for energy storage in the coming decades. So I think we're gonna wait for questions to the end. I don't know if there's any really important clarifying questions that we need to resolve, or we'll just go on to Will's presentation.
I would suggest why don't we move into Will's work? We've got several questions in the Q&A, and since we're going to post the webinar later, why don't we get all the presentation stuff done, and then we can absorb all those questions at the end. So thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. You mind continuing to drive for me? That'd be great.
Sure.
So my name is Will Fraser. I'm a researcher with the READS team. READS is our capacity expansion model at NREL. So it's a model that simulates future investments and decision making in the electric power sector. It's a national scale model that we use to analyze economic deployment. And for this study in particular, we did a deep dive into the economic storage deployment that we see in the model. So this model uses a least cost framework, and there are no markets included. This is a central planner approach, and all decisions are made by the model completely based on the economics of the resources that are available to it. Given that there's a high amount of uncertainty in the different cost inputs that we have, we analyzed several different scenarios, 19 in this particular study. We focused on our sensitivities regarding our battery cost projections, but we also did some scenarios with different costs for wind and solar, and for natural gas prices, and also for transmission costs. So you can go to the next slide, Paul. Thank you. So storage is a very difficult aspect to model in our model. And over the past 3 years, we've made many improvements to the READS model so that we could answer the questions that we want to answer here in the storage feature study. Three of the most important are noted here. Previously, we used only a single year of historical weather and load data for analyzing system reliability, whereas now we use 7 years from 2007 to 2013. Our storage resources are split out by duration, and this is so that we can capture those relationships that Paul was talking about between the power and energy component of storage in his framework. And we can split out the benefits relative to the cost of storage for these different services that storage can provide, like capacity, energy time shifting, and operating reserves. And also we use an hourly dispatch of generation, storage, and transmission to inform these investment making decisions, whereas previously we had some heuristic methods that we had applied. So I want to emphasize that this work is focused on diurnal storage, and we're only looking at scenarios up to about 80% renewable energy penetration. And that's because, as Paul mentioned, beyond that, there's a lot of questions that we still have yet to answer. And so those are beyond the scope of this study. We're focusing on diurnal storage. And when I say diurnal storage, I mean storage with 12 hours or less of duration. So anytime I say storage for the rest of this presentation, just bear in mind I mean 12 hours or less. So you can go to the next slide, Paul. So as Nate mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we see significant deployment of storage across all of our scenarios. On the right here, we have all 19 of our resource sensitivity scenarios with the different cost inputs that we use. We see in our reference case, we get to about 200 gigawatts of storage by 2050. Even in our high battery cost scenario, the scenario where we use our high battery cost projections, we get to about 150 gigawatts of storage by 2050. And in some of our scenarios where we have, low battery costs, low PV costs, high natural gas prices, we see storage deployments that far exceed that. And on the left here, we can sort of see the phases that Paul was talking about play out with the storage deployment over time. So we see starting in the 2020s, we start with some 2-hour and some 4-hour storage deployed for primarily for providing peaking capacity. And over time, as the amount of 4-hour storage that can be deployed for peaking capacity is saturated, we start to see 6, 8, and 10-hour storage deployed beyond that. It's also worth noting that we do see continued deployment of 4-hour battery storage, and that's because with the increased PV deployment that we see in the model, that shifts the peak, as Paul mentioned, and allows for more opportunity for these shorter durations to continue to provide peaking capacity. You can go to the next slide, Paul. So here's an example of that interaction between PV and PV and battery storage, and we've also included a scenario here where we have low wind costs. So in the blue, that's our load profile in California in 2050, and in the orange and green, we're looking at the net load for the low PV cost scenario and for the low wind cost scenario. So in our low PV cost scenario, there's lots of PV deployment, and we see that the net peak there in the evening around 6 to 8 p.m., as Paul mentioned, becomes squished and condensed such that storage can provide more peaking capacity and needs less energy capacity to do so, relative to the low wind cost scenario where there is much more wind deployment in that scenario, and winds the generation profile of wind doesn't have the same predictable diurnal pattern that PV has, and doesn't have that same sort of synergy that we see between PV and storage. So we use these net load profiles to inform the capacity value of storage. And we also use our energy price profiles from our hourly dispatch to inform the energy time shifting value of storage. And in both cases, PV works well with storage because the lower the net load is, the more likely it is for a less expensive resource to be setting the price of energy, and that can be arbitraged against the higher prices in the evening where, when we have lots of solar and almost no wind, those prices are highest. So both the capacity value and the energy time shifting value of storage is enhanced by PV deployment. And we'll see that in the next slide. Paul, if you want to go to that one. So on the left here, we have our peaking capacity potential of storage as a function of PV penetration. And so this is the total amount of diurnal storage that could provide firm capacity. And even with the grid as it is today, we see that there's about 100 gigawatts of firm capacity potential for diurnal storage. And as PV penetration increases over time, we see that double and sometimes even exceed 200 gigawatts by 2050. On the left, we also have our energy time shifting potential. So this is the amount of energy across the year where it is economically favorable to store energy and dispatch it later. And we see that there's a strong correlation there between PV penetration and storage potential as well. So these are just parameters that are used to inform the optimization. So we can go to the next slide. And within the actual optimization, we also see a very strong correlation between PV and kind of a fuzzy sort of inconclusive relationship with storage and wind. So on the left, we have the total amount of energy that's used that goes through storage. So the total amount of generation relative to the amount that's used to charge storage. And we have that as a function of PV penetration on the left and as a function of wind penetration on the right. So we're plotting, this is from all of our 19 scenarios across all years from 2020 to 2050. And we have the aggregate national numbers in those large yellow dots, and this, the smaller blue dots represent regional numbers. And again, we see a strong relationship, a strong synergy between storage and PV on the left, and the story between storage and wind is quite a bit more complicated there on the right. And the reference case, I will note, has about 7% of the total generation in 2050 is used to charge storage. We can go to the next slide. So we see a strong synergy between PV and storage. We've mentioned that several times, and we get a lot of questions about wind. We do see that transmission correlates more with wind. So at the end of the day, storage really is just providing a flexibility service to the grid. It's allowing the grid to be a little more flexible in time. And given the very predictable diurnal profile of PV, it's not surprising that temporal flexibility would be favorable for that resource. We see that spatial flexibility or increased transmission is more favorable with scenarios that have higher wind penetration. So in the top right, we have our transmission capacity from 2020 to 2050, and in the bottom right, our wind capacity. And that red line is our low wind cost case, where we see almost or a little more than 500 gigawatts of wind by 2050. And we see substantial transmission capacity additions in that scenario. On the left, we have our battery capacity, top left, and the bottom left is the PV capacity. And you see in the low PV cost case, that orange line, we see about a terawatt of PV by 2050. And there's an additional 75 to 100 gigawatts of battery storage deployed in that scenario relative to the reference case. So our results indicate that the spatial flexibility of transmission tends to correlate more with wind, and the temporal flexibility of storage tends to correlate more with PV. So we can go to the next slide here, Paul. So we also ran some scenarios where we tried to tease out some information from the model about which services storage can provide are the most valuable. We have our three battery cost scenarios here, our low battery cost reference and high battery cost case. And for each battery cost scenario, we ran a scenario where we restricted batteries from providing firm capacity in the model. We ran one where we restricted batteries from obtaining any value from shifting energy and time. And we ran a scenario where we didn't allow batteries to provide operating reserves. So the dashed line is the scenarios that we've already seen before, where batteries can provide all of these services. And we see that in the scenario where batteries cannot provide firm capacity, which is the pink purplish line on the bottom in each of these, that's when we see the least amount of storage deployment. So if storage isn't allowed to provide firm capacity or isn't properly compensated for that service, we see that's a significant barrier to storage adoption in the electricity sector. The next most important would be energy time shifting. We see the blue lines in the middle there are the lines where storage is allowed to provide peaking capacity. It's allowed to contribute towards the planning reserve margin that we require the model to have, but storage isn't compensated for shifting energy and time. It isn't allowed to recover any curtailment from wind or PV. And we see that the combined value of both of those services is really needed to for storage to reach its full economic potential in the electricity sector. And I will note that the yellow line where storage can't provide operating reserves is very close to our reference scenario where batteries can provide all these services. And we only model battery durations down to about 2 hours. And as Paul mentioned, those services only go up technically, and the market provision, the markets for those services only go up to about 30 minutes. So if we did have shorter durations of storage, we may see a bigger impact from those scenarios. So this isn't to say that those services aren't important, but it is to say that the limitation, the technical limitation of those, as Paul mentioned, is rather small relative to these much larger market sizes for capacity and for energy time shifting. And we have one more slide here. So I'm going to spend a little time here because there's a lot to digest on this slide, and there's some pretty cool stuff here. So this slide really gets at the third phase that Paul was talking about, the age of ubiquitous storage, and we can kind of see how in some of these different scenarios, phase 3 can evolve very differently. And that's because, if you take away anything from this slide, that blue box on the right there, within the model here, storage is optimized based on the relationship between the value of capacity and energy and the storage duration and how all those tie together. And also the storage duration is inherently tied to the cost, as Paul covered earlier as well. So what we're looking at is for each of these scenarios, we have the peaking capacity potential plotted as the hatched bar. And the solid bar on the right is the actual economic deployment from the model. So in our reference case on the left, we see that there's the potential for slightly more than 200 gigawatts of storage to provide peaking capacity based on the shapes of the net load profiles. And the actual economic deployment of storage closely aligns with those. And that indicates that capacity value is the strongest driver for energy storage or for battery storage deployment in that scenario. We saw that previously with the relative values of the different services as well. In the next scenario, the low PV cost scenario, we see that with the additional PV deployment in that scenario, the amount of storage that can receive firm capacity goes up from about 200 gigawatts to about 250 gigawatts. So from 29% PV penetration in the reference case in 2050 to 43% penetration of PV in 2050, we see an increase of about 50 gigawatts of peaking capacity potential for storage. And once again, the actual economic deployment of storage aligns quite well with the different durations that would be required for storage to provide peaking capacity. Same story with the low wind cost scenario, just inverse. When we go down to about 22% PV penetration, the potential for storage to provide peaking capacity goes down to about 175 gigawatts. And again, we see the economic durations that are deployed closely align with the durations that are needed for storage to provide peaking capacity. In these last two scenarios, the high natural gas price scenario and the low battery cost scenario are where things start to get a little bit interesting. So in the high natural gas price scenario, we see there's much more PV deployment. So there's 41% PV penetration in this scenario by 2050. There's also more wind deployment in this scenario relative to the reference case. And given the higher energy prices during the peaking hours because of the higher natural gas price, the value for energy time shifting actually tends to drive storage deployment more than the provision of peaking capacity. So we see that in 4-hour storage in that scenario could provide, a little more than 100 gigawatts of peaking capacity, but the model only chooses to deploy about 75 gigawatts and switches to 6-hour storage sooner than it would need to so that it can take advantage of the energy time shifting possibilities given the high natural gas prices and the excess generation from wind and PV. And we see a lot of 8-hour storage deployed in that scenario as well. The low battery cost scenario, however, we see a lot of 4-hour storage deployed, and then about the same 6-8 hour storage deployed as in the reference case, or similar to the low PV cost case. And this is because, as Paul mentioned, the curtailment, the opportunity for storage to recover curtailment from PV is typically only about 4 to 6 hours in the middle of the day. And in this scenario where batteries, the cost for producing batteries comes down so much that it's actually economic to build a lot of these shorter duration resources so you can soak up that energy during the afternoon hours. And then over the course of 4 to 8 hours overnight, you dispatch that energy to the grid and recover the energy time shifting value, and provide some peaking capacity, but less than you could if you were dispatching at your full inverter capacity. So some interesting pieces that we see from the model there of how phase 3 could develop differently based on how the grid evolves over time. So I think we just have a summary slide here with some key takeaway points. So capacity value drives deployment, but energy arbitrage value is also needed to realize optimal deployment. Strong synergy between PV and storage, significant growth across all scenarios. And lastly, I would like to emphasize that although these are our cost projections for lithium-ion batteries, a lot can happen between now and 2030 even, and any storage technology that can meet the cost and performance values that were used in this paper, in this study, would be competitive and can be substituted in. So these results aren't specific to lithium-ion batteries. And that's all we have. Thank you, Paul. I think there's a couple slides. I don't know if Nate or Paul wants to wrap up, or if we're going to go to.
Thanks. Will those extra slides at the end are in case they come up in questions?
Okay.
And again, just close. Thank you guys very much. This was really a great overview of these two studies, and I will just add quickly that we're going to have more webinars and more studies coming out, and then we're always looking at new scenarios. I do want to circle back to a couple of the questions that are in the Q&A, and I think the first two from Fernando Morales are probably for Paul. Accounting for battery degradation in one, and then another one on Ireland. Paul, can you see those, or would you like me to read them?
I am struggling to get the Q&A window.
I think if you hit the arrow next to Q&A, it should open up.
Yep, I've got it. Sorry, it's just really small for me. I can only read one line at a time. Let me try again. I'm going to have you read them until I can figure this
Okay.
out.
Sure. So the first one is pretty short. When considering duration for frequency response, do you consider oversizing needed to account for battery degradation?
Yeah, so whenever you so one of the things that's really important when we're talking about duration is we're talking about usable duration over the expected warranty life of the battery. So essentially, when we talk about a 30-minute device, um, we're saying, okay, we want to provide 30-minute response with X number of cycles over a 10 or 12-year lifetime. And inevitably, of course, even without degradation, based on just simply state of charge limits, where you want to keep the battery between 20 and 80% or something like that, you're already going to start to oversize it. But that's really up to the battery vendor to do those calculations. If I'm a turnkey IPP, as part of the as part of the contract, I'm going to say, here's how I'm going to use the battery. This is what I want, and the battery manufacturer is going to give me the amount of capacity needed. Now, one thing, of course, I can do is I can augment over time, and that's one of the real interesting advantages of storage. People talk about, one of the disadvantages of storage being a short lifetime. That can also be an advantage if you do the life cycle cost calculation, thoroughly. If you're doing a 20-year life cycle cost calculation to compare a 12-year asset to a 20-year asset, yeah, you might have to replace or augment, but you can take advantage of the declining cost of batteries. So you install what you need now, and then in X number of years, when you need to augment or replace some fraction of the batteries, you can expect a decline in price. Now, you always have to do the full calculation. We're not getting something for free here, but that all does need to be accounted for when you're doing your calculation of what the costs are going to be and how much battery you need.
Thanks, Paul. I would just add on the replacement piece too. Always remember that the actual battery pack, which you would likely be replacing, is just a fraction of the overall battery system cost. So there's a lot of containers and other parts and permitting, et cetera, that likely would not be needed when you're augmenting the battery. So the next question was, and I'll paraphrase a little bit, but in Ireland, derating factors for capacity provisions peak at 6 hours, and the logic is based on statistical analysis to determine equivalent firm capacity. Is this methodology used to determine the 4-hour attributed full capacity credit to serve peak demand?
Yeah, that's a super fun question. So, essentially, yes and no. In some places, the 4-hour battery has very little justification historically. I mean, some of the original 4-hour battery rules coming out of California, they were the first one. I certainly couldn't find an ELCC calculation or an EFC calculation based on that. So you can just, a lot of it is just based on kind of eyeballing the curve, and that's, the purists would say, oh, that's you got to do the math. But it actually turns out that when you do the math, when you do a proper ELCC calculation, and I would point to some of the work that's been done, not just at NREL, but a number of other folks. Strape has done a number of calculations using their Servum tool for both California and PJM. And they demonstrate that 4 hours actually does look like a pretty good number for strongly summer peaking systems. So yeah, you do need to do the math, and the answer is what it is. And in some places it will be longer. If you've got a winter peaking system, those are the ones that are really tough, because you go to some place like Seattle, which is a winter peaking system, you can get pretty long peaks. So you got to do the math right. But fortunately, in summer peaking systems in the U.S., 4 hours is good enough, at least for now. And that's the real big caveat. You will saturate that eventually.
Okay, I'm going to jump down to a question for Will. So it says, for the relative value of storage services slide, so where you've allowed it to provide different services, do you implement the scenarios by an actual restriction in the model, or do you just give that service 0 value? How does that work? And maybe we could go back up to that slide, Paul, if that's okay.
Yeah, there's a
Sorry,
restriction in the
which
model.
slide are we doing? Sorry.
That one.
Okay.
There is a restriction in the model. So there is a constraint in the model requiring that there is sufficient firm capacity in each region. And in the scenario where we don't allow storage to provide firm capacity, storage is not allowed to provide that service. So the model has to acquire all of that firm capacity from other resources. In the scenario where storage can't provide energy provide energy time shifting, we don't allow storage to charge from curtailment. And we do allow storage to discharge as needed during peak hours, because if enough storage is contributing towards the planning reserve margin, then some of it would need to discharge during the peak hours. Otherwise, we'd have an infeasible solution within the model, but it's not allowed to charge from curtailment, and the difference in energy prices within the model for conventional resources are small enough such that storage is often operating at a cost to provide those services if it can't recover energy from these lower cost resources. So yeah, these are implemented as actual restrictions within the model.
Great, thank you. And maybe I'll continue down to this question from Trevor Brown. 2 questions regarding sector coupling. First, if grid additional electricity is used to decarbonize hydrogen ammonia production, assume 500 gigawatts for that market, what impact does this oversizing of renewable energy generation have on the cost of the carbon-free grid? It's a little afield of storage specifically, but I think relevant. And second, if seasonal storage was not required because you could simply import molecules at the moment of demand, i.e. utilities purchase ammonia at spot market prices, how does that affect the cost? So I don't know if either one of you wants to take those questions. Either one of those could be a year-long study. So
yeah,
so quickly just come up with an answer here in a second.
I'll take a crack at that one. Yeah, so when you move beyond diurnal storage and you're talking, seasonal storage, there are so many questions yet to be answered. What's the fuel going to be? How is the electric vehicle market going to affect the demand of electricity? What's going to be the flexibility there? There are lots of very interesting questions there, and we do have ongoing work trying to answer some of those questions. But for this particular study, we just wanted to, really dig in and dig into the value of diurnal storage, and get a nice understanding of this so that we can use this as a jumping off point to answer some of those very important and very interesting questions. Yeah, those are very good points.
So last question on long duration, probably for Paul. It says, which battery storage technology is best suited, most economical for the longer duration storage applications? And then secondly, PSAHKs and lays are based on synchronous generation. And does your analysis consider transient stability services for these technologies?
Oh, super fun questions. So for the first one, so I'm a technology neutral analyst. I'm a power system engineer, electrical engineer. So I'm not really a chemist and can't really speak to the kind of the nature of the technologies. I mean, the goal of a lot of the folks working in the battery industry is to change really the cost curves of. I'm gonna just go to this one. Really quickly. So the basic idea is that you've got these different slopes, right? You've got the basic idea is that lithium-ion battery probably has some floor on the energy-related cost of the pack, right? I mean, and I don't want to get into whether or not that's going to be $50 per kilowatt hour or $100 per kilowatt hour, but somewhere in there, right? So the idea is, okay, lithium-ion batteries are probably going to be the cheapest thing for 4-hour batteries, but what about something? And people often talk about liquid electrolyte flow batteries, and those flow batteries have a lower energy cost. They might have a higher power cost, and so the idea, without showing a separate graph, might be something like the difference between the pump storage curve and the battery curve, where there's an intercept, and that intercept might happen at 6 or 8 or 10 hours of storage. And so the goal behind a lot of battery manufacturers is to get the costs of the energy component down, where there will be this transition point. But which technology, whether or not it's going to be a flow battery or a new chemistry, you'd have to talk to the battery experts there. But certainly there's a lot of batteries under development that have the potential opportunity to intercept at some point lithium-ion batteries at some duration. In terms of the second one, I mean, that's a great question. So yes, I mean, some technologies use synchronous generators, and synchronous generators can do a bunch of things that power electronics-based machines sometimes have a limited ability to do. But we do need to be careful, because when we talk about the types of services that can be provided by power electronics-based machines, most of the items on this list can be provided by a battery. A battery can change its power output, and most of the requirements of ancillary services are changing real power output. Now, where there's maybe some challenges, historically, this is something like voltage support, where, again, increasingly power electronics-based machines can provide that. A lot of people point at something like inertial response, which is provided seamlessly and automatically by synchronous machines. But ERCOT is doing a lot of work on things like fast frequency response, where they can very quickly respond to a change in frequency and reduce the amount of inertia. So the real challenge is, yeah, you need some minimum amount of inertia, but if ERCOT keeps doing what they're doing, the amount of that inertia required will decrease. There's kind of maybe a floor before you go to completely grid-forming inverters, but the opportunities for something like synchronous generator-based storage is worth considering, but I wouldn't make a business model on just those services. I'd need to be really careful, because, again, like all industries, you have to watch out what's coming from behind and side. And as power electronics-based machines increase their capability to provide services, you may find that the opportunities for providing something like inertial response shrinking. So that's my only concern about relying too heavily on synchronous machines. That kind of that silver bullet, or whatever you want to call it, of benefit of synchronous machines.
Thank you, Paul. And just quickly add that in our model inputs report, which was not covered today but is published on the website, we do also talk quite a bit about a whole variety of storage technologies, including short and long duration technologies, and do some comparisons between them. So thank you to both our presenters and everyone who came today, and we will be posting the slides and the webinar online soon. And please watch our website for additional reports. Thank you.